Good afternoon, everyone. We're very excited to be here live again this afternoon for a special edition of our LinkedIn Live series, which has been focusing more generally on government relations and government funding for nonprofits in Canada. But today we're going to actually do a special focus on the international cooperation sector, which is a sector where myself and my colleague Diana, who's on the call as well, have had a lot of experience. Just to give you a very brief introduction. So my name is Jessie Clark. I founded this firm, Jan Clark Consulting, back in February 2021. We're a progressive feminist government relations firm. We're dedicated to helping empower nonprofits to achieve their goals with government. And again, I founded this firm because I've seen so many organizations face unnecessary challenges in building a strong relationship with government. And I really believe that advocacy, engagement, and seeking government funding are everyone's business, and that not only is the nonprofit sector's voice welcome at the table, but it's really needed at the table where policy decisions are being made. And I think, nowhere maybe in Canada, others may dispute this is my opinion, but I think there's a particularly close and healthy working relationship in the international development sector in Canada. And that's what we're here to talk about today as well. So just to give a bit of a background on that, back in the end of October, the third week of October, my colleague Diana and I attended Cooperation Canada's Futures Festival in Ottawa. Cooperation Canada is kind of the leading umbrella organization for international cooperation sector NGOs in Canada and nonprofits, and acts as a convening body, coordinates policy, coordinates information, has played a very strong role in the sector for many, many years, maybe close to 30 years now. One of the highlights of their annual calendar is a festival that they've held, or has been an in-person conference in various forms for many, many years. Actually, in my case, it happened to be the last in-person event that I attended prior to COVID, other than a brief overseas trip. I attended their conference in Ottawa back in November 2019. Which was a great session, a series of conversations around Canada's foreign policy, Canada Feminist International Assistance Policy, and development policy, and also included some great opportunities to interact with Global Affairs Canada and partners. Well, and then fast forward now, we had COVID, and 3 years later, we were back there again in Ottawa for another conference. And I'm very happy to have Diana joining me today. Diana Apostolidis is a senior associate at Jan Clark Consulting. She joined us back in August, and she has had a lengthy and really impressive career in the sector, working for humanitarian organizations, working for international development-focused organizations, doing proposal development, business development, program management, working for funders as well, worked for the MasterCard Foundation, among others, and has also been a program director for a Canadian organization. So Diana, it's great to have you here, and it was great to have you in Ottawa as well. We had a good week together. Diana kindly agreed to share the Airbnb with me while we were there. What I thought we would do, because we came back from that week, with I think it was such a rich week, and there was so much interesting content. We're not going to be able to do it justice in 20 to 30 minutes today. But I think that, we can share some highlights with you and take any questions if you have them, and maybe spark a bit of a conversation. I think that there was a lot that took place in the conversation. First of all, I also just want to make very clear that this is our opinion. The caveat: we're not experts necessarily. I would say we're experts in the sense that we've worked in the sector in Canada for a very long time. I would certainly consider myself an expert vis-a-vis maybe Government of Canada and Global Affairs Canada specifically, but not in every sector international development by any stretch of the imagination. We're not necessarily, conflict experts or, decolonization, localization experts or any of those things. So just to put that caveat out there as well. But that being said, we both have, a number of years of experience in the sector. And I think we're really excited to be here today to talk to you a bit about some of our key takeaways and learnings from that week. In addition to everything else, honestly, it was just very exciting to have an in-person event for the first time in such a long time, and to see many former colleagues and friends from over the years. So that was just a very nice background. But I think also, that was really reflected in the format of how Cooperation Canada put the event together. I think they acknowledged that really what people are looking for right now is that connection. And they created a lot of opportunities very consciously and deliberately for networking, which I really appreciated. It wasn't one of those conferences where you're trying to squeeze meetings into the corners and the margins. There was a lot of time allocated for really rich conversations. And, the conversations and overall, I mean, I was really struck by how after 3 years, how much the conversation in the sector has shifted just in that time, particularly, I think, in light of the global conversation around anti-Black racism and the impact it's had on the sector, in terms of looking more closely at our own, colonial roots and looking at how we can, and the racism within the sector as well. And I think also in terms of the conversation that's taken place in Canada over the last several years on Indigenous reconciliation, and that, the inclusion of Indigenous voices and perspectives was a given during the conference this week, that week, which was really appreciated as well, not, kind of an add-on. Not to say that it was perfect, and I'm sure that, I know that there are things that can be improved, but I appreciate that there were people in the room who were really dedicated as well to holding conference organizers and participants to account on those issues and to really pushing the conversation forward. It was also a great opportunity to hear from our new, relatively new, still International Development Minister, Minister Sajjan, who spoke, very frankly and in a lengthy series of remarks over lunch and in a very informal panel. And also Global Affairs Canada in general really needs to be lauded for their participation. They had Associate Deputy Minister for Partnership, Patricia Pena, was there the entire week. And on Thursday, which was focused on the GAC sector relationship, there were, I think upwards of maybe 30 or 40 senior staff in the room who were sitting at tables and speaking to NGO representatives, including many director generals and ADMs from different branches. So I really appreciated the level of engagement and access that we had from GAC officials as well. So those are kind of just some very high level reflections. Before I turn it over, Diana, over to you for maybe your initial thoughts and kind of what you thought your key takeaways were from the week's events.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't mind my dog in the background, by the way. I forgot to put her down. So if you see her walking around, I'm sorry about that. No, but I think you did a great job, Jesse, of sort of outlining kind of in a nutshell how the workshop was organized, how it was structured, some of the key kind of highlights. I agree. The day that I think it was on the Thursday was really focused on, GAC and giving participants the opportunity to really have deep conversations with various GAC officials. In addition to having sort of plenary sessions every day, there were also a number of concurrent sort of thematic sessions. And so Jesse and myself, we sort of tried to attend as much variety of sessions as possible. So perhaps my takeaways, I might have different takeaways than you, Jesse, but I think, at a high level, and I think the title of this conference, lends to this, the overarching theme for sure was sort of contemplating, envisioning sort of the future of international cooperation, not just in the near future, but looking, outwards to 2050. I think that was one of the timelines that had been referenced. So I think within that, some of the other kind of key themes I took out of it was, the future of international cooperation at a global level. So, the sort of structural reform that needs to happen with the geopolitical infrastructure, going then to Canada's own future role in international cooperation and leadership. There were a lot of sort of discussions and themes, I think, that came out of that. And then finally, also going even more granular to GAC as an institution, and how it is going to adapt its systems to be fit for purpose and fit for this new vision of international cooperation. So we can kind of I can dive deeper into that in terms of some of the key kind of takeaways that I got. But I would say from my experience, that's how I would sort of speak to sort of those high level themes.
Great. Oh, that's great. Thanks, Diana. Yeah, and I agree. I think that, that's kind of what some of the themes that came out was really reflecting on. I think there's been a question that's been around the sector for many years, which is what is Canada's place in the world. But I think more importantly now, it was much more about, what is a development agency's place in global development and in the sector, and what are our NGOs based in Canada? What is the role that we can play that can be constructive and that can really contribute to shaping the kind of future we want to see? I think that's one of the ways I've seen the conversation really shift. There were some incredible panelists. I don't even want to start naming them because I'm going to miss some of the ones that were really incredible. But, one of course that stood out to me in particular was the Afghan professor who had obviously an incredible lived experience, is now a professor in Canada, and was reflecting back on Canada's intervention in Afghanistan, and of course, how everyone's perspective has changed on that, of course, in the last couple of years because of everything that's gone on since withdrawal, and the devastating humanitarian situation that's ongoing there, and really then reflecting on, what are there lessons that can be drawn from that for the kind of traditional Western colonial in many ways kind of approach, but also an approach that really works to try and bring together development, defense, diplomacy for the first time in Canada very explicitly, I think. And really what was the impact of that, and where are we now? So I thought that was a really provocative and interesting conversation and reflection, and certainly relevant. And I think, that was one of the themes that came up a lot. It was around, I think given Minister Sajan's own background and interest in the military, but also just the reality of global politics these days as well, conflict and conflict sensitivity emerged a lot as a key theme. So Diana, I don't know if there's anything you wanted to speak to on that in terms of what you observed or heard when you were there.
Yeah, I think that sort of theme of conflict and conflict prevention and how those working kind of in international cooperation can contribute to that. There was a whole session on sort of reimagining the triple nexus. Typically, when we think about triple nexus, we're thinking about humanitarian emergency response. We're thinking about sort of that early recovery kind of transition period, and then we think of development. This whole session, for me, it was also a newer way to look at the triple nexus, but I imagine it's probably been sort of a school of thought that's been around for a while. But it's this idea of adding sort of peace as part of this triple nexus. So looking at the humanitarian development and then peace, and how those actors who are working in those spaces can sort of better coordinate with each other. So that was a really interesting, I think, session. And I think from Minister Sajan, from when he was sort of speaking, you're right. I mean, he has the vantage point of having worked as the Minister of Defense, and now he's the Minister of International Development, right? So he has that vantage point. From his words, he sees the work of the international development sort of NGO sector as being very, very critical to conflict prevention, in the sense that the work we do has the potential to really address some of the structural root causes of the problems that we're trying to really solve. And again, this links back to this idea of the triple nexus with peace. During the workshop, they tried to kind of differentiate between capital P peace versus smaller, lowercase peace. The former really being sort of a political process, whereas the latter is very much around sort of positive, they call it positive peace. So working on addressing some of those structural, issues that are causing, the conflicts that we're seeing, and trying to help sort of prevent conflict moving forward. So I think, yeah, absolutely, that was quite a prominent theme, and the use of both Canada's involvement in, for example, the Afghanistan conflict and our role in that, looking at that as a case study, and then also looking to today in terms of Ukraine and sort of what we're seeing there. I think, one thing I took out of that, and I think maybe it relates to that theme that I mentioned around Canada's own sort of future role in international development and international cooperation and leadership, is really realizing the FIAP's true potential. One thing that I really took out of that discussion with the panelists, including the woman you mentioned, who had sort of that background in sort of Afghanistan, and she has a lot of experience working in that context, is, unpacking the FIAP within the security and peace building domains, how that, was a missed opportunity potentially on the part of Canada in terms of our involvement in Afghanistan, that if we had actually really adhered to the principles in the FIAP, we might have seen a more positive outcome to not resolving, but positively contributing to the peace process there.
Yeah, that's such an interesting point. I find it interesting too, because if I look back over my own career, Canada has been at the forefront of conversations around women, peace, and security. We were famously sponsored a UN resolution on women, peace, and security. We have the ambassador, but I think it's still a fair, criticism, or at least certainly a consideration, maybe, in terms of thinking about the extent to which those specific efforts have been supported by cooperation, development assistance from Canada, and actually concrete activities. And I'm sure there are, I know some partners out there who've done incredible work over the years in that area, but in terms of really moving that agenda forward on a bilateral basis, it's something that I think Canada has certainly endeavored to do. But it's a very interesting question that she was posing in terms of what does it really mean to apply the FIAP? And I think that was also an interesting part of the conversation, because the FIAP isn't new anymore, right? It's now been, it's 7 years since the Liberal government came into power. I think it's officially about 5.5 years since the Feminist International Assistance Policy was announced. And there certainly was some discussion and reflection on what has been the impact of that so far in the sector as well, which I thought was an interesting conversation. And what difference it's made. I don't know if that's something that you came across for you, any of your remarks as well, or any of your thoughts. But I think that theme, and then also just the other theme, of course, that was in the room, so heavily around localization, I think was also very interesting to hear reflections on. So just over to you, Diana, for some thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think I forget what session it was. It might have been maybe on the Global Affairs Canada Day. Like there was like that whole day focused just on GAC. I know that they definitely had a reflection on sort of the FIAP itself, and they talked a little bit about sort of what were the key funding like initiatives under FIAP. They listed a number of them, including the 1.4 billion commitment to health sector spending. They talked about, the Women's Voice and Leadership Fund, the Equality Fund, Charlevoix commitment. I think I definitely got a sense of sort of trying to highlight some of the milestones, I guess, under FIAP. What was the other question? What was your follow?
No, that's okay. No problem. I was just thinking, because I think, FIAP, but then the other theme that came up a lot in conversations in the plenary, and then also in I think in specific sessions around localization.
Yeah, I attended a session on sort of the localization question, and I found some, we've talked a lot about these terms. At least for me, I've attended a lot of these types of conferences, and I feel like these kind of key terms like localization, intersectionality, these are things that we do talk about. I do find the conversation often very at the theoretical level, and that would be maybe that was sort of some of my feedback from those sessions that I attended, where we're still very much talking about it at that like conceptual level, and sort of understanding the framing of that within our sector, and sort of some of the best practices that we've seen, some of the, what not to do if you're trying to pursue more localized approaches. I didn't feel like that came out as much in the sessions, but that was my take. I don't know if you had a similar feeling, or if it left more to be desired from your perspective.
I think you're right in the sense that it's still a bit more of a buzzword at this point than it is, an actual process transformation, or really, relationship and power transformation in a more meaningful way. I think there's still a lot of work to be done to really shift things in that direction. And it's hard also. I think, a lot of the institutions that this sector was built on are themselves fundamentally, very colonial, right? So I think that's a big challenge for the sector. What I did appreciate, though, was that one element that I know has come to my mind a lot, and clearly not just to my mind, because there were a lot of other people there who were thinking about it, is the ways in which GAC structure and processes themselves can support or undermine localization. Mm-hmm. And so I was happy to hear a number of people from Global Affairs who are really seized with this question and talking about it actively. And I think it's also one of the things that's underlying the grants and contributions transformation as well. Sorry, just 1 second.
Yeah, I mean, that might be a good transition to talking a little bit more about sort of this grants and contributions transformation sort of initiative that GAC spoke about sort of on that last day. And it's funny that you bring up the localization piece, because I know that one of the maybe reflections after the presentation that I had with some colleagues was just that from the way that transformation process was presented, it did seem quite divorced perhaps from this whole localization kind of agenda to some extent. It could be potentially a missed opportunity. But we can maybe talk a little bit about sort of what that process is looking like based on what GAC had shared, and then maybe talk through some of the limitations maybe that I personally kind of felt. So I can sort of maybe walk through what that discussion looked like, and then if you wanted to add, Jesse. So, because I know a lot of people who are probably calling in would be interested to hear a little bit about this. It's probably going to directly impact the work of actors kind of working in this space in the Canadian context. So essentially what GAC is hoping to do is between now and 2027, so about a 5-year process, they're looking to reform a number of what they're calling their sort of enterprises that, create sort of GAC internally. So those sort of 6 enterprises are their data framework, business processes, the risk management framework that they use, their results and performance framework, partner engagement framework, and their financial system. They didn't go into sort of like the nitty gritty about what that's going to look like for each enterprise. But in terms of what they sort of, in terms of the how, the man who presented this sort of plan really wanted to emphasize that this is going to be a very collaborative, transparent, and an approach that really does emphasize co-creation. So what that's looking like in practice, consistent engagement with the sector, providing updates sort of on how this transformation process goes at each major milestone. So the next update to civil society is likely going to be during the next International Development Week. They also mentioned establishing some sort of a partner working group as well that would be convened over the next 6 to 8 weeks, which I feel like could be any time now. November, December, they shared. Members of this group sort of being neutral and helping to sort of support this reform process. I don't know since the workshop if there's been any movement towards that in terms of identifying working groups or how partners can get involved, but I think it's certainly something to look out for. And yeah, a lot of this, the why GAC is doing this is because, they've received over the years a lot of feedback from the partners that they work with. Things like, feeling as if things aren't super transparent when it comes to, working with GAC, especially when it comes to, for example, getting the status of like a project approval. That partners are ultimately all treated the same, that, certain requirements of large partners are often not tailored to smaller partners. So a lot of this is coming from the critiques of civil society. That's really what is sort of driving this enterprise transformation.
Yeah, thanks, Diana. Yeah, it's an ambitious project. I mean, I was, from my perspective, I think, a couple of thoughts. I was very pleased to see that they brought in, someone, Brandon Lee, who's going to be leading this up, who is, has experience in sort of large scale organizational transformation in a variety of private and public sector roles in the past. So to me, that speaks to the level of commitment from the department, that they're actually, investing some resources and bringing this in. And I also appreciate that they, clearly, and just what you were describing, I mean, they reflected on the feedback they've heard, over and over again, I know, over the years, from partners for many, many years, about, some of the concerns around how slow the processes are, how complex they are, how time consuming they are for partners. So it's exciting to see that coming to the table, and being open for, having an open conversation. But I think there's a lot of promise because that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. I mean, to your point, I think it's, that focus is really around technical, structural, financial pieces. And that's because that's kind of the nature of the grants and contributions portfolio. So, a lot of it's going to be on changing the way that those systems operate. I think that certainly in kind of corridor conversations I had with folks there, including GAC officials, there's an acknowledgement that there's a very strong connection between that and ultimately, any other kind of transformation around localization, for example. But I think that there was an effort made. My personal, again, this is just my own 2 cents, but my personal take on it was that there was an effort made to separate those 2 exercises out, because in terms of how decisions are made within government, that I think you can get. They want to be able to carve off and protect the space for this grants and contributions transformation to proceed, even if there may be a change in terms of political leadership or other trends and directions as well. So I think I can understand why, from that perspective, they would want to do that. And I think it's also, it's part of a bureaucratic, overall bureaucratic approach as well, to really focus on fixing things in a technical sense, in a very specific and detailed sense, because that's much more within their scope, and appropriately within their scope, I would say, than maybe making, sort of large scale systemic changes, and maybe a little bit easier as well. But again, though, I was just encouraged to see, I mean, there was a huge turnout for that session, a lot of interest in the room, a lot of engagement, and a huge amount of transparency already from GAC in sharing, what they're planning to do with this process. So that was great to see.
Yeah, and I mean, it was obviously in terms of the time frame that they kind of talked about. They said the first kind of year and a half, which I guess is what we're currently in. It would be around like setting the foundations for this. So what are sort of the targets, the goals? This is something that they're hoping to really engage civil society in, as part of that process. Years 2 to 3 is looking at sort of the automation phase, putting the systems and prototypes kind of in place. And then year 4 and 5 is on customization and then the strategic kind of rollout and thinking about how to do that. Is it maybe based on a grouping of partners, or is it based on sort of certain regions? I think that is something that they're hoping to really think through. But it does sound very ambitious in terms of the scale of what they're trying to do, as well as the time that they're trying to achieve it in. And you sort of did mention already, but I think to temper expectations, the presenter sort of said, whatever sort of type of transformation GAC can engage in is very much going to be tempered by its Treasury Board requirements. And it's going to also have to really take into account GAC's rotational system when it comes to the key kind of leadership that sort of manage certain departments and certain teams. I guess there is a bit of that rotational. I think it's every 2 years that they try to sort of switch that out. And I think that came in response to a question around how will political will be maintained for this initiative over the next 5 years. Oh, you're muted, Jesse.
No, absolutely. And I apologize because my light has gone off as well here. So my lighting is not as good as it was at the beginning of the stream. I think, we're kind of at time now, so I'm just gonna wrap it up. And I think that we could talk for a very long time about this week because it was very rich, and I think also gave us a good insight into some future trends that are emerging and some priorities we may expect to see that kind of go beyond what's in the mandate letter, for example, and go and speak more to some of the priorities that we'll see from GAC in coming years. And I think we're always happy to take questions after the fact. This will be available to watch later as well over YouTube and also on LinkedIn. So feel free to share it with colleagues or to message us if you have any questions or further follow up. And always happy to continue the conversation. So thanks so much, Diana, for being here today as well. And I'm really glad that everyone could join us, and I hope you found it worthwhile.